absolutely loves to talk, but my daughter stays in the background making noise. I wait to do this until she takes a nap. The second I turn it on, she's like, here I am, fucking wide awake.
Room, turned right, and Chapter 53. With Nef-Dada and a dozen soldiers in Cenarian livery trailing behind him, Roth sprinted across the catwalk. He reached a small room, turned right, and pounded up a narrow set of stairs. It was a dizzying maze of corridors, walkways, and service stairs, but it would get Roth and his men to the North Tower twice as fast as any other route. Time was of the essence. So many plans that Roth had planted, watered, and coaxed into bloom over the past years were bearing fruit tonight. Like a greedy child, he wanted to taste every one and let the bloody juices spill down his chin. The Queen and her two younger daughters were dying right now, Roth realized with regret. It was too bad. Too bad he wouldn't get to see it. He hoped nobody would move the bodies before he could come inspect them. He'd given orders, but though he trusted Hugh Gibbet to carry them out meticulously, this was war. There was no telling what would happen. There was no help for it, though. There was no way he would have missed watching the king die. How exquisite that was! If Roth hadn't been dodging around corners, he'd have burst out laughing. He'd planned to have a bolt cranked in his crossbow and pointed at the king's forehead all night. He'd planned to be the one to kill the king himself, but Captain Arturian's security had been too tight. Roth had been able to get into the Great Hall, but he hadn't been able to bring a weapon. It had been a small disaster. If Durzo Blint hadn't come through for him, the entire plot would have failed. Father would have killed him. But it didn't fail. Durzo had come through for him, and what a virtuoso performance it had been. The poisoning of the guests had been brilliant. Roth had been in the kitchens as the food tasters had tried every dish, and not one of them had even been ill. The delivery of the king's poison had been a marvel of athleticism. The concoction itself had worked even better than Blint had promised. Roth would find more work for that man. With Durzo as his tool, Roth would dispense such exquisite agonies as he'd never before imagined. Herbs! He'd never even thought of their potential. Durzo would be just the one to guide him in all their uses. Who would have imagined that herbs given to the king would push Aegon over the edge? He had positively giggled when the Lord General had relieved the fool king of his head. It had been better than doing it himself. He'd never had the particular thrill of watching a man commit what he himself must have seen as treason. There was something very fine about seeing a man damn himself. Roth and his men had tarried in the Great Hall just long enough to see that the Lord General and his men had taken the bait and were on their way. And then they had run. If he had planned this right, and Roth planned everything right, he'd taste even finer fruits than Aegon's betrayal tonight. Father would be so pleased. 600 of the God King's elite Highlanders were to arrive at the castle within the next half hour. 1,000 more would arrive at dawn. The king had told Roth that he wanted to lose less than half of those by the time he arrived with an occupying army the next day. Roth thought he would lose less than a quarter, perhaps far less. He'd pass his Urtan brilliantly. The God King would appoint Roth King of Cenaria and take the title of High King for himself. In time, he'd pass the entire empire to Roth. Pushing future glories from his mind, Roth came to a stop in the last narrow corridor as his men caught up. The door before him would open on unseen hinges into the stairway at the bottom of the North Tower. Roth motioned to his men. They slammed the hidden door open and burst into the hall, swords flashing. The 2 honor guards posted at the base of the tower didn't stand a chance. They barely had time to register surprise before they were dead. "We hold this door. Aegon doesn't go upstairs," Roth said. "The prince and princess are next." He checked his crossbow. Logan sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. He closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. He was, for the moment, alone in the bedchamber at the top of the North Tower. Janine Gunder, no, Janine Gyre, had left him to get ready. To get ready. Logan felt ill. He'd fantasized about lovemaking, of course. He found his best to confine his desire to one woman, and that woman wasn't Janine. When Sira had accepted his proposal, he'd thought his fantasies were going to come true. They'd been planning a wedding just this morning. Now this. He heard the soft scuff of bare feet on rug, and looked up. Janine's hair was down, curling luxuriantly halfway down her back. She wore a silky, translucent white gown and an anxious smile. She was breathtaking. Every hint her evening gown had given last night, God, was that only last night? Was fulfilled. Every sensuous promise exceeded. Logan's eyes drank in her curves, her hips sweeping to a narrow waist, waist swelling to those perfect breasts, curve yielding to curve with the sweetness that inspired art. He feasted on the gold of her skin in the candlelight, the darker circles of her nipples showing faintly through her gown, the flutter of her pulse at her throat, the bashfulness in her stance. He wanted her. He wanted to take her. Lust roared through him, dimming the rest of the room, swallowing all the world except the beauty before him and his thoughts of what he was about to do. He looked away, ashamed. A lump swelled in his throat and cut off his breath. "Am I so ugly?" she asked. He looked up and saw her arms crossed over her breasts, instant tears in her eyes. Pain. He looked away again. "No. No, my lady. Please. Come here." She didn't move. It wasn't enough. Logan met her eyes. "Please. You're so pretty, so beautiful, you bewilder me. You make me ache. Come sit with me, please." Janine sat next to him on the bed, close, but not touching him. Logan had known little about her before today. Even his father had considered her too rich a match for him. He only knew that she was well-liked, sunny, settling down, and not yet 16. Logan could understand Sunny. She'd practically glowed at dinner, until her father had spoken, the bastard. Logan understood now a little of how his father must have felt, seeing the woman he loved married to that. The term settling down had been applied to Janine's brother, too. For the prince, it had meant that people thought he was finally leaving off his more obvious wenching and starting to assume some of the responsibilities of ruling. But Logan imagined that for Janine, settling down probably meant she didn't play tag in the castle anymore. She was so different from Sira. And she was his wife. I'm I was engaged to another woman this morning. A woman I loved for years. I still love her, Janine. Can I call you that? You may call me whatever pleases you, my lord husband. Her voice was chilly. He'd hurt her. She was hurt, and for all the wrong reasons. Damn, she was young. But then, he hadn't been the only one who'd been handed a lot of surprises in the last day. Have you ever been in love, Janine? She considered his question with more gravity than he would have expected from a 15-year-old. I've liked boys. It's not the same, Logan snapped. He regretted his own instantly. Are you going to cheat on me? She shot right back. With her? It hit Logan between the eyes. This couldn't be easy for Janine either. How must she feel, liking him, marrying him, knowing he was in love with someone else? Logan put his face in his hands. I swore our wedding vows because the king asked me to, because the nation needed it. But I swore those vows, Janine. I will be faithful to you. I will do my duty. And your duty to produce an heir? She asked. The chill hadn't thawed at all. He should have known better. But he answered, yes. She flopped on the bed, pulling her gown up roughly, and spread her legs. Your duty awaits, my lord, she said, turning her face away, staring at the wall. Janine, look at me. He covered her nakedness and, thank the gods, looked only at her face as he spoke, though even now her body cried out to him. It made him feel like an animal. Janine, I'll be as good a husband as I can, but I can't give you my heart. Not yet. I look at you and I feel wrong for wanting to make love to you. But you're my wife. Damn it! Easier if you weren't so damn beautiful. If I could just look at you without wanting to do what we're supposed to do tonight. Do you understand? She obviously didn't, but she sat back up and folded her legs under her. Abruptly, she was a girl again, blushing for what she'd just done, but her eyes intent. Logan threw his hands up. I don't blame you. I don't understand it myself. It's all so twisted up. Nothing makes sense since Elaine... Please, don't talk about my brother tonight, please. I've lost everything. Everything's wrong.
Finally, she's asleep.
How could he be so selfish? He'd lost a friend, but she'd lost her big brother. She must be aching too. I'm sorry, he said. No, I'm sorry, Janine said, her eyes teary, but her gaze steady. I've known for my whole life that I'd be married to whomever the country needed me to marry. I've tried not to even have crushes because I knew that my father might tell me any day that he needed me. I've been trying not to like you for 2 years. I know you think I'm a silly girl, but do you know who some of my potential husbands were? A Sioran prince who likes boys, another who's 60, an Alatiran who's 6, a Lodrakari who doesn't speak our language and already has 2 wives, Caledorans who treat their women as chattel, and a Modaini who's been twice widowed under suspicious circumstances. Then there was you. Everyone likes you. A good king would have made the match to heal the split between our families, but my father hates you. So I had to watch you, hear stories about you from my brother and from all the other girls. Hear that you're brave, you're honorable, you're loyal, you're smart. My brother told me that you were the only man he knew who wouldn't be intimidated by my mind. Do you know what it's like to have to use small words and pretend not to understand things so you don't get a bad reputation? Logan wasn't sure he understood. Surely women never had to pretend not to be stupid. Did they? When I found out I was marrying you, Janine said, it felt like all my little girl dreams were coming true. Even with my father behaving like... And Sira? And Aline? She took a deep breath. I'm sorry, my lord, husband. You've been honest with me. I know you didn't ask for this. I'm sorry you had to lose her so I could have you. I know you've had a lot of bad surprises recently. Her chin raised, and she spoke like a princess. But I'm going to do all I can to be a good surprise, my lord. I'm going to strive to be worthy of your love. By the gods, what a woman. Logan had looked at Janine last night and seen breasts. He had seen her giggling with her friends and seen a child. He was a fool. Janine Gunder, Janine Gyre, was a princess, born to be a queen. Her poise, her deliberate self-sacrifice, her strength awed him. He had hoped his wife might grow to become a good match for him. Now, he hoped that he might grow to become a match for this woman. And I'll do all I can to make our love grow, Janine, Logan said. She put a finger on his lips. Will you call me Jenny? Jenny? Logan touched the soft, smooth skin of her cheek and let his eyes roam over her body. I'm allowed to do this. I can do this. I should do this. Jenny, may I kiss you? She abruptly became an uncertain girl again, until their lips met. Then, even with all her hesitations, uncertainty, and naivete, to Logan, she was all that was warm and soft and beautiful and loving in the world. She was all that was woman, and she was altogether lovely. His arms circled her, and he pulled her close. Some minutes later, Logan pulled away from her on the bed, turning his head toward the door. Don't stop, she said. Hobnailed boots pounded up the stairs outside the door. Lots of boots. Not even pausing to pull on his clothes in the darkness, Logan rolled off Janine and caught up his sword. Chapter 54. Regnus Gyre ducked back into a hallway as Brant Aegon ran past with a dozen royal guards, and inexplicably, a few fat nobles. "Long live the king! To the prince!" one of them yelled. To the prince? The rumors must have been wrong then. Regnus had heard that Aline Gunder had been murdered last night. Had the Lord General been alone, Regnus would have called out to his old friend, but not with Vin Arturi there. Vin was duty-bound to arrest Regnus, and he would, even if he didn't like it. They were shouting in the distance, toward the center of the castle, but Regnus couldn't make out any words. Having so much happened that he didn't understand made him anxious, but he could do nothing about whatever was happening elsewhere in the castle. He only had 6 men, none of them in armor. It had been hard enough to smuggle themselves in as servants and still bring swords. All he could hope to do was find Nalia and get her out of here. The Queen's chambers were on the 2nd floor of the castle, in the northeast quarter. Regnus and his men had been walking through the castle nonchalantly, in 2 groups of 3, trying not to attract the servants' attention. But now he gestured sharply. His men gathered around him, and he started jogging. They got to the Queen's chamber without running into a single servant or guard. It was unbelievably good luck. Against even a pair of royal guards who would be armed and armored, Regnus and his unarmored men might all have died. Regnus pounded on the great door, and then opened it. A lady-in-waiting who'd been about to open the door fell back in surprise. "You!" she said. "Milady, run! Murderer!" Nalia Gunder was seated in a rocking chair, embroidery obviously untouched in her lap. She stood immediately, but waved the servant off. "Don't be a fool. Begone." Her two younger daughters, Elena and Elise, both looked like they had been crying. They stood uncertainly, neither old enough to recognize Duke Gyre. "What are you doing here?" Queen Nalia asked. "How did you get here?" "Your life's in danger. The man who attacked my estate last night has been hired to kill you tonight. Please not. Please, my queen." He looked away. "My lord," she said. It was how a queen might greet a favored vassal. It was also how a lady might address her husband. In those two words, Regnus heard her say, "I've never loved anyone but you." "My lord," she said again. "Regnus, I'll go wherever you lead. But we can't go without them. If I'm in danger, they are too. Your girls can come along. I mean, Logan and Janine. They wed this afternoon. Long live the king." To the prince, the noble's brief cries suddenly made sense. They'd abbreviated it. The king is dead, long live the king. They meant long live the new king, the prince. Logan. King Gunder was dead. Logan was the new king. A better man would have had other thoughts first, Regnus knew. A better husband would have had other thoughts first, but his first thought was that Nalia's husband was dead. The hateful little man who'd caused so much misery was gone. His own wife was gone too. He and Nalia were both suddenly, miraculously freed from 22 years of bondage. 22 years. And what he'd thought was a life sentence had suddenly been commuted. He'd consigned himself to the satisfactions of a proud father and an able commander, never believing that he'd have anything but marital agony to come home to. Now, happiness wasn't just a dim possibility. It was here, one step away, beaming at him, eyes full of love. What a difference it would be to come home to Nalia, to share her home, her conversation, her life, her bed. If she would have him, he could marry Nalia. He would marry her. The other implications came to him more slowly. Logan was the new king. The genealogists would have nightmares if Regnus and Nalia had children. He didn't care. He laughed aloud. His heart was so light. Then he stopped. Aegon, the guards, and the nobles had been running to his son, armed with dinner knives. Logan was in danger. Those men had been running to save him. Logan was in danger, and Regnus had turned aside. There wasn't time to explain everything, to tell Nalia that she was free, that Elaine was dead. Regnus had to act. He had no idea how much time they had left. "They're in trouble. Follow me," Regnus shouted, lifting his sword. Something hot lanced through his back, and then was gone. Regnus turned and rubbed his chest, irritated. He saw something black flit into the shadows as blood suddenly bloomed from one of his men's throats. As if they were marionettes whose strings had been cut, his men fell, one after another in rapid succession, dead. Regnus's hand came away from his chest. He looked down. Blood was spreading on the front of his tunic over his heart. He looked up at Nalia. The shadow was behind her, holding her. One black hand held her chin up. The other held the long, thin short sword that had killed Regnus. But Nalia's eyes were fixed on him, and wide with horror. "Nalia," he said. He dropped to his knees. His vision was going white. He tried to keep his eyes open. But then he realized his eyes were open. And it didn't matter anymore. Lord General Aegon and his ragtag band of nobles and royal guards were not making good time. Through the centuries, the castle had undergone several expansions and no simplifications. Twice, the general's men had been stopped by a locked door, argued the relative merits of hacking it down or going around, and decided to go another way. Now, they ran down the last hallway to the North Tower, the royal guards sprinting, Aegon running, and several of the nobles wheezing their way down the long hall. The nobles had long since given up their earlier enthusiastic cries of "To the Prince" and "Long live King Jair." They were saving their breath now. Aegon entered the tower's antechamber to the sound of men cursing and beating at the door to the stairs. One of the royal guards, Colonel Gare, was standing at the entrance to the antechamber. "Hurry, my lords!" he urged the last two paunchy nobles. Scanning the room, Lord Aegon let the younger, more athletic men attack the thick door to the stairs. The room wasn't large, barely 20 feet square, sparsely furnished with ceilings so high they were lost in the darkness. And just two doors, one to the stairs and one to the hall. There was no going around this door. Something wasn't right. That the door was locked meant that the guards posted here had either been killed or subverted. Lord General Aegon looked over his shoulder to where Colonel Gare was ushering the last nobles into the room. Aegon pushed past Logan's cousin, the fat Lord Lojine, and started to shout a warning. But before he could get a word out, Colonel Gare's mailed fist caught him in the chin. Falling backward, Aegon could only watch from the floor as Colonel Gare slammed the doors and threw the bolt. One of the royal guards threw his shoulders into the door an instant later, but it held. And a moment later, Aegon heard the door being barred. "Trapped," Lord Urware said helpfully. Moment. Everyone in the room stopped. As the Lord General stood with the assistance of one of the royal guards, he could see the implications hitting the men. If they'd just been betrayed by one of their own, then the attempt on the prince's life wasn't isolated or poorly planned. Everything in the last few days had been orchestrated, from Prince Elaine's death to their own arrival at this dead end. Their odds of surviving weren't good. "What do we do, sir?" one of the guards asked. "Get through that door," Lord Aegon said, pointing to the door guarding the stairs. It was probably too late. They would probably find enemy soldiers and dead royals up those stairs. But Aegon had long ago learned not to waste time on the battlefield lamenting what you should have done, what you should have seen. Recriminations could come later. If there was a later. The guards had renewed their assault on the door when the twang hiss of a crossbow bolt rang out. A royal guard went down, his mailed chest pierced as easily as if he'd been wearing silk. Aegon cursed and stared around the room for murder holes in the walls. He could see none. Men looked around wildly, trying to guard against an enemy that attacked from nowhere. Twang, hiss! another guard stumbled into his comrades and fell dead. Aegon and the men looked up into the darkness. A low-hanging chandelier destroyed their chances of seeing beyond. A low laugh echoed out of the gloom it hid. Guards and nobles alike scrambled for whatever cover they could find, but there was precious little to be had. One soldier rolled behind a thickly stuffed wing-backed chair. A noble tore a portrait of Sir Robin from a wall and held it before himself like a shield. "Door!" Aegon barked, though his heart was clouding with despair. There was no way out. The man or men shooting them not only had numbers and traitors in the castle, they also knew the castle's secrets. The paranoid King Herlac had honeycombed his expansion of the castle with secret rooms and spy holes. Because he knew where they were, this assassin had merely to sit in place and murder them all. There was no way to stop him. Twang! Hiss! The soldier sitting behind the great chair stiffened as the bolt tore through the chair's back and penetrated his. The assassin was letting them know the hopelessness of their plight. "The door!" Aegon shouted. With the kind of courage many commanders would demand, but few would get, the rest of the guards jumped up and began hacking at the door. They knew that some of them would die doing it, but they also knew it was their only way out, their only hope for life. Twang! Hiss! Another royal guard crumpled in the middle of a swing at the door. Lord Ungert, weakly holding the portrait before himself, wailed like a little girl. Twang! Hiss! A soldier seemed to leap sideways as a bolt punched through his ear-hole and threw him bloodily into the door frame. A rent appeared in the door. One of the remaining 3 royal guards gave a shout of triumph. An arrow flew in through the gash in the door and buried itself in his shoulder. The man spun around once before a bolt from above clove his spine. Both of the last 2 guards snapped. One dropped his sword and fell to his knees. "Please," he begged. "Please no! Please no! Please!" The last was Captain Arthurian. He attacked the door like a man possessed. He was a strong man, and the door shuddered and rocked under his blows, the gap widening, stretching to reach the latch. He dodged as 2 arrows sped through the hole and past his head, then attacked once more. Another arrow streaked past Vin Arthurian, and Aegon saw his head whip back. His cheek had been grazed, cut in a neat line, his ear sliced in half. Screaming, Captain Arthurian threw his sword through the hole like a spear. He grabbed the latch and tore it out of the door, jerking as an arrow went into his arm and out the other side. Ignoring it, he seized the door and heaved, tearing it from the frame. 5 Caladoran archers, wearing Cenarian livery, stood on the stairs with arrows drawn. 6 swordsmen and a witch stood behind them. Another archer lay at their feet, the guard's sword sprouting from his stomach. The 5 archers released their arrows simultaneously. Riddled with arrows, Captain Vin Arthurian dropped backward. His body landed next to the guard on his knees, who shrieked. Twang! Hiss! The shriek ended in a gurgle, and the young man fell, drowning in his own blood. Then came one of those eerily normal moments in the chaos of battle that Lord Aegon had seen before, but could never get used to. One of the archers handed his bow off, stepped into the room, and grabbed the door. "Excuse me," he said to the captain he'd just helped kill. His voice wasn't sarcastic, simply polite. He pulled the door out of the captain's death-clenched fingers, stepped back into the stairwell, and propped the door in place as Lord Aegon and the nobles watched him. In that no time, before reality came crushing back into place, Lord Aegon looked at the nobles. They looked at him. These were the men who'd been willing to put their own lives at stake to rescue the prince. Brave men, if some of them fools, he thought as he looked at Lord Ungert shielding himself with a painting. These were the men he'd led to death. The trap was clever. The Gyre servant who'd announced the attack on Logan had doubtless been one of the usurper's men. The ploy not only split the royal guard, taking most of them away from the Great Hall, it also neatly separated the wheat from the chaff. The lords who had come with Aegon weren't even exactly the men he himself would have expected to defend Prince Logan, but they were all men who had shown their loyalties in the only way that mattered: with their actions. By killing these men, the Calidor would eliminate the very men most likely to oppose him. Brilliant. Under the sound of the dying soldier's gurgling and rasping breath, Aegon heard another sound. His ears identified it immediately. It was a crossbow's windlass being cranked. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. "So you know whom to curse as you die?" a voice, darkly amused, said from his hideout above them. "I'm Prince Roth Ursul." "Ursul," Lord Brayton cursed. "Oh, it's an honor then," Lord Logire said. The bolt caught Logire through his fat stomach and struck with such force that it tore out of his back, taking a good part of his viscera with it. He sat roughly against a wall. Several of the lords damned Ursul, as he had invited. Some went to comfort Lord Logire, wheezing and shaking on the floor. Lord General Aegon remained standing. Death would find him on his feet. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. "I want to thank you, Lord General," Roth said. "You have served me well. First you killed the king for me, a nice bit of treason, that. And then, despite that, you were able to lead these men to my... You will be rewarded well." "What?" Old Lord Brayton asked, looking at Brant with alarm. "Say it's not true, Brant." The next bolt went through Lord Brayton's heart. "It's a lie," Lord Aegon said. But Lord Brayton was dead. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. Lord Ungert looked at Aegon, terrified. The canvas shook in his hands. "Please, tell him to stop," he begged Aegon as he saw that he was the last noble standing. "I didn't even want to follow you. My wife made me." A small hole appeared in Sir Robin's painted shield, and Lord Ungert staggered backward. For a long moment, he stood against the wall, grimacing, canvas still in hand. He looked disgusted, as if the canvas should have stopped the crossbow bolt. Then he fell on the painting, breaking the frame to splinters. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. "Bastard!" Lord Logire said between thin gasps, staring at Lord General Aegon. "You bastard!" The next bolt hit Lord Logire between the eyes. Lord General Aegon raised his sword defiantly. Roth laughed. "I wasn't lying, Lord General. You'll have your reward." "I'm afraid," Lord General Aegon said. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. The bolt hit Aegon's knee, and he felt bones shatter. He stumbled to the chair and fell. Moments later, another bolt tore through his elbow. It felt like it had torn his arm off. He barely held himself sitting on the floor, clutching the arm of the chair like a man drowning. "My wet boy told me I could trust you to run blindly into this trap. After all, You were stupid enough to trust him, Roth said. Blint! Yes. But he didn't tell me you'd betray your king. That was delicious. And marrying Lord Gyre into the royal family? Friend of yours, isn't he? You cost Logan his life with that. Now, I know you're not afraid to die, Lord General, Roth said. The reward I give you is your life. Go, live with your shame. Go on now. Crawl away, little bug. I'll spend the rest of my sorry life hunting you down, Aegon said between gritted teeth. No, you won't. You're a whipped dog, Brant. You could have stopped me. Instead, you helped me every step of the way. My men and I are going upstairs now. The prince and princess will die because you didn't stop me. So, why would I kill you? I couldn't have done this without you. Roth left the Lord General there, gasping on the floor, shattered. Chapter 55. Sergeant Bamron Gamble drew the Alatiran longbow with the broad muscle of his back. It didn't matter if you were as strong as an ox. You couldn't draw an Alatiran longbow with your arms. The bow was thick yew, 7 feet long, unstrung, and it could punch through armor at 200 paces. He'd heard of men hitting a 4-foot target at over 500 paces, but thank the God he didn't need to do that. He stood on the roof of the guardhouse in the castle yard. They'd been barricaded in by a traitor, but the coward had either not had the stomach or not had the torch to set fire to the guardhouse with them inside it. Gamble's men had knocked a hole in the roof and lifted him out. The witch's first bolt had flown high past the sergeant's head before he even strung his bow. The witch was the only Meister in the yard, stationed to keep an eye on things, evidently. From Gamble's perch, he could see that more troops were streaming over the East Kingsbridge even now, but he had eyes only for the witch. It was a woman, her hair red, skin pale. She was breathing heavily, as if the last bolt had taken something out of her, but she was already pulling herself together, chanting, the black veer on her arms straining. If he missed, he wouldn't get a second shot. The witch would aim this shot low, and it would set fire to the thatch roof of the guardhouse. More than 40 of Sergeant Gamble's men would die. His back flexed, and the broad head slid back. 3 fingers slid toward his face. The gut string touched his lips. There was no aiming. It was purely instinctive. A ball of fire ignited between the witch's palms. The broadhead jumped right through the flame, and the power that would have carried the arrow through armor had no trouble piercing ethereal flame or a young woman's sternum. She was blasted off her feet as if tied to a horse at full gallop. The arrow pinned her body to the great door behind her. Sergeant Gamble wasn't conscious of having drawn another bow. If he'd had another choice, he would have chosen to get off the roof and let his men out. But suddenly, battle was singing in his veins. After 17 years as a soldier, he was fighting for the first time. The arrow touched his lips and leapt away. This one hit another witch, leading a file of Highlanders across the bridge. It was a brilliant shot, one of the best shots of Gamble's entire life. It flew between 3 rows of running soldiers and hit a witch in the armpit as she pumped her arms while running. It blew her sideways off the edge of the bridge. She tumbled, limp, into the waters of the Plith. The Highlanders didn't even slow. That was when Sergeant Gamble knew they were in trouble. The archers and a witch peeled off from the group and began looking for him, but all the other men proceeded across the bridge. As the archers drew their arrows, the witch touched each, and fire attached to each arrowhead. Gamble slid down the roof and dropped into the yard as 2 burning arrows sank into the thatch. The fire spread unnaturally fast. By the time he unbarred the door, there was already smoke pouring out of the inside of the barracks. "What do we do, sir?" one of the men asked as they crowded around him. "They can't take us all at once, so they're trying to separate us. I'd guess there's 2, maybe 300 of them. We gotta get to the lower barracks." There would be 200 men there. That would be even odds, at least. Not that Sergeant Gamble thought even numbers would even anything. Not against Caladoran Highlanders and witches. "To hell with that," a young guard said. "I'm not dying for Niner. We still got East Kingsbridge. I'm out of here." "You head for that bridge, Jules, and it's the last thing you'll do," Sergeant Gamble said. "That is what they pay us for. Anything less than our duty is betrayal. Just like Conyers locking us in the barracks to die." "They don't pay us shit." "We knew what they paid when we signed up." "You do what you gotta do, sir." Jules sheathed his sword and turned confidently. He started jogging for the bridge. Every man in his 39 was looking at Sergeant Gamble. He drew, whispered a prayer for 2 souls as the string touched his lips, and sent the arrow through the back of Jules's neck. "I'm turning into a regular war hero, aren't I? Skilled at killing women and my own men." "We're going to fight," he said. "Any questions?" Kylar sprinted through the servants' quarters unseen. Still no soldiers had come running. Things had to be bad somewhere for the soldiers not to have organized any resistance. Abruptly, he was on a fight. At least one detachment of others must have come in another way, because 20 of them were busy slaughtering twice as many Cenarian soldiers. The Cenarians were on the verge of breaking, even as their sergeant was bellowing orders at them. The sight of the man's face stopped Kylar. He knew that sergeant. It was Gamble, the guard who'd come into the North Tower the day of Kylar's first kill. Kylar joined the fray and killed Caladorans as easily as a scythe cuts wheat. It was simple labor. There was no joy in killing men who could barely see him. At first, no one noticed him. He was of darkness, deep in the bowels of a castle constructed of dark stone and lit with flickering torches. Then he saved Gamble's life, beheading one Caladoran and eviscerating another as they cornered the officer. Kylar didn't even slow. He was a whirlwind. He was the first face of the Night Angels. He was vengeance. Killing was no longer an activity. It was a state of being. Kylar became killing. If every drop of guilty blood he spilled might blot out a drop of innocent blood, he would be clean tonight. The feeling of mail parting, of leather parting, of flesh parting along the icy judgment that was retribution, was the best feeling in the world. Kylar was lost in a madness, a kind of bizarre meditation, spinning, thrusting, lunging, cleaving, piercing, battering, smashing, ruining face-snuffing futures. It passed all too quickly, for in what could have been more than half a minute, every last Caladoran was dead. None was even dying. The killing wrath was nothing if not thorough. The effect on the Cenarians was monumental. These sheep in guards' armor stood, gaping at the ragged darkness that was Kylar. Their weapons weren't even raised. They didn't stand in ready positions. He just marveled at Death's avatar among them. "The Night Angel fights for you," he said. He'd already paused too long. Logan could be dying right now. He ran deeper into the castle. All the doors were closed, and the halls were eerily quiet. He could only assume that the servants were huddled in their rooms or already fleeing. The pounding of many footsteps keeping time brought him up short. Kylar sank into a shadowed doorway near a corner. He might be safe from the eyes of men, but there were things more dangerous than men in the castle tonight. There must be a good 200 of their soldiers trapped downstairs, one of the officers was saying to a man whose narrow build gave him away as a witch, even though he wore armor and a sword. It'll hold for maybe 15 minutes, Meister. And the nobles in the garden? The witch demanded. His answer was lost in the tramp of the Highlanders' feet as they wound past Kylar and into the distance. So, the nobles were trapped in the garden. Kylar had never been to the garden before, indeed, had avoided the castle as much as possible, but he'd seen paintings of the garden, and if the artist hadn't taken too much license, Kylar supposed he could find it. He guessed that was as good of a place as any to look for Logan and Durzo. As he wound deeper into the castle, toward the garden, dead men began to clutter the halls, their blood slickening the floors. Kylar didn't even slow as he ran past. The dead were mostly nobles' guards. Poor bastards. Kylar didn't have much sympathy for men who took up the profession of arms and then didn't train themselves. But these men had been massacred. Well over 40 guards were dead and dying, kicking and frothing in pain. Kylar only saw 8 Highlanders dead. Following the blood and the corpses led Kylar to double doors of walnut, barred from the outside. He lifted the bar and eased the door open. "What in the hell?" a gruff voice with a Caladoran accent said. Retreating from the crack, to stand behind yet another picture of Niner standing in a heroic pose, Kylar saw several Highlanders guarding a room full of nobles. There were men, women, and even a few children in the group. They were disheveled and frightened. Some were crying. Some were throwing up. Poisoned. Footsteps tapped across the floor from behind Kylar's line, and the Highlanders he could see readied their weapons. The point of a halberd hooked the corner of the door and pulled it open, revealing a squat Caladoran officer as thick as he was tall. The officer pulled the other door open with the halberd. Then he beckoned, and 2 men jumped into the hall, back to back, swords raised. They looked right at the statue, right at Kylar, who'd pressed himself against the statue's back, putting his arms behind its arms, his legs behind its legs. "Nothing, sir," one said. Inside the garden, which wasn't nearly as grand as it looked in the paintings, were 10 guards and 40 or 50 nobles, none of them armed. Mercifully, the Highlanders had no witches with them, or assumed witches were too valuable to be wasted guarding prisoners. The nobles included some of the highest in the land. Kylar recognized more than a few of the king's ministers. That they were all here meant that Roth believed he would take over the castle quickly, and he wanted to be able to personally decide whom to kill and whom to add to his own government. The men and women looked dazed. They didn't seem to believe what had happened to them. It was beyond their comprehension that their world could turn so completely upside down so quickly. Many were obviously ill. Some were torn and bloodied, but others were absolutely untouched. Some ladies whose hair was still perfectly coiffed wept, while others bearing gashes and torn skirts seemed poised and calm. Behind Kylar, a soldier said, "Bleeding mercy, Captain. It didn't just unbar itself. We're here to guard this room, and we stay here." "But we don't know what's out there, sir." "We stay," the squat captain said, in a voice that brooked no argument. Kylar almost felt bad for the young Highlander. The young man's instincts were right. One day he'd have been a good officer. But that didn't stop Kylar from dropping the shadows a pace away from him. He told himself he wasn't becoming visible to be fair. He'd need his strength later. The young Caladoran's sword had barely cleared its scabbard when Kylar disemboweled him. Then he danced past the man, throwing a knife with his left hand, parting hardened leather armor and ribs with an upward cut, and guiding a sword hand past his side and the sword into another soldier's body in a smooth motion. Kylar jerked his head forward into a Highlander's face and spun with the man quickly. The man's back absorbed the captain's halberd with a meaty crunch. Kylar dropped under a slash and stabbed up into a Highlander's groin with his wakizashi. On his back, he knocked the man back with a kick and used the force of the kick to spring to his feet. 6 men were dead or down. 4 remained. The first was impetuous. He charged with a yell, something about Kylar killing his brother. A parry and riposte, and brother joined brother. The last 3 moved forward together. A quick cut deprived one of sword and sword hand, and the next crossed swords with Kylar 5 times before he didn't dodge back far enough and fell eyeless from the slash across his face. Kylar jumped over the sweeping halberd and turned to face the officer. He reversed his grip on the sword and stabbed behind him, impaling the one-armed soldier. The officer dropped the halberd and drew a rapier. Kylar smiled at the extremes of the man's weapon choices and then looked over the officer's shoulder. The man started to turn, frowned, and didn't look back. A pretty noblewoman smashed the back of his head with a planter. Flowers and soil flew everywhere, but the planter itself didn't so much as crack. "Thank you for saving us," she panted. "But damn you for looking at me. You could have gotten me killed." She was one of the women whose hair and makeup had been the least disturbed by whatever violence had brought her here. She looked completely unruffled by having just crushed a man's skull. She merely brushed dirt from her dress and checked to see if she'd dragged it through any blood. Kylar was surprised that she hadn't spilled out of her low-cut dress when she'd run. He recognized her. He didn't look back, did he? Kylar asked Tara Grayson, glad for the black silk kerchief over his face. He'd worn the mask out of habit, but if he hadn't, some of these nobles would have recognized him. "Well, I never." There was a knock on the door, and she and everyone else froze. 3 knocks, 2 knocks, 3, 2. A voice called out, "New orders, Cap. His Majesty says to kill 'em all. We need your soldiers to help quell resistors in the courtyard." "You need to leave, immediately," Kylar said loudly enough that all the nobles could hear him. "That's at least 200 more Highlanders coming over West Kingsbridge. They're probably the ones fighting in the courtyard right now. If you want to live, collect whatever weapons you can and free the soldiers who are trapped downstairs. Others are already heading there. With them, you can make it out of the castle. You can start a resistance. You've already lost the castle. You've lost the city. If you don't move fast, you'll lose your lives." The news hit the nobles, crowding around Kylar like cold water. Some of them shrank even more, but a few of them seemed to find their backbone as he spoke. "We'll fight, sir," Tara Grayson said. "But some of us have been poisoned." "I know those poisons. If you've lived this long, you've taken a small enough dose that you'll recover within a half hour. Where's Logan Gyre?" "Excuse me. I'm Tara Grayson, now Queen Grayson. If you..." Kylar's eyes narrowed. "Where's Logan Gyre?" "Dead. He's dead. The king's dead. The queen's dead. The princesses are dead. All of them." The world rocked. Kylar felt as if he'd been clubbed in the stomach. "Are you sure? Did you see it?" "We were with the king in the great hall when he died, and I found the queen and her younger daughters in their chambers before I got caught. They were... It was awful." She shook her head. "I didn't see Logan and Janine, but they must have been the first to die. After the king announced their marriage, they'd not left the great hall 10 minutes before the coup started. The Lord General took men to try to save them, but he was too late. These men were just bragging about how they slaughtered the royal guards." Where? I don't know, but it's too... Does anyone know where Logan went? Kylar shouted. He saw from the looks on their faces that some of them knew, but they weren't going to tell him because they were afraid he would leave them. The cowards! He heard a moan further back in the garden, and he pushed through the standing nobles to see a pasty, pale man sweating on his back. His mouth was crusted with froth, and there was a puddle of vomit near his head. He looked so bad that Kylar almost didn't recognize him. It was Count Drake. Kylar knelt by the Count and grabbed leaves from his herb pouch and began stuffing them in the Count's mouth. "You have an antidote?" one of the sick but standing nobles asked. "Give it to me." "Give it to me," another demanded. They began pushing forward. Kylar whipped retribution out and put the point on a noble's throat. "If any of you touch me or him, I'll kill you. I swear." "He's only a count," a fat, quivering noblewoman said. "He's poor. I'll give you anything." The hard, vengeful part of Kylar wanted to withhold the antidote, just to repay their meanness, their pettiness. Instead, he grabbed the bag of antidote and tossed it to Tara Grayson. "Give it to those who need it most. It won't save anyone who's already unconscious, and anyone still standing doesn't need it." Her mouth opened at being so frankly commanded, but she obeyed. Time was slipping through Kylar's fingers. He was here. He was in the castle, but he had no idea where in the castle he needed to be. He looked down at the Count, wondering if he was too late to save him. The Count stirred. His eyes opened, slowly focused. He was going to make it. "North Tower," he said. "That's where Logan went?" The Count nodded, and then lay back, exhausted. "It's too late for them," Tara Grayson said. "Fight with us. I'll give you lands, titles, a pardon." But heedless of the noble's gasps, Kylar wrapped himself in shadows and ran. Roth's men pounded up the stairs and kicked open the door to the bedchamber. Roth and Nefdada followed as the 11 men pressed into the room amid grunts and cries. Even though the double doors were wide enough for 3 abreast, with 4 ranks in front of him, Roth couldn't see what was happening, except to know that it wasn't good. There was the sound of flesh hitting flesh, the sound of a sword cutting through mail, the sound of a skull bursting like a melon. Beside him, Nefdada had extended his veer-marked arms. He muttered, and a quarter of the veer wriggled. An eerily silent concussion blew men in every direction. Even Roth's men were blasted off their feet. The 3 directly in front of him hurtled backward, but as Roth braced for the impact, they smacked against an invisible barrier Neff had erected to protect him. Neff spoke again, and the room filled with light. Roth stepped inside with Neff as everyone recovered. Logan tried to jump to his feet, too, but his limbs were anchored to the floor as if by a great weight. He was naked and furious. Roth sheathed his sword as 8 of his men collected their scattered weapons. 6 men lay on the floor, all bleeding from deep wounds. 3 of them were dead. 3 would be soon. Apparently, Logan Gyre was no slouch with a sword. On the bed, wearing a hiked-up, translucent nightgown, lay the princess, thrashing, terrified, but she couldn't cover herself. Ned immobilized her, too. Roth sat down on the bed next to the girl and let his eyes roam over her nubile body. He licked a finger, put it at the base of her neck, and traced it down her body. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said. Janine Gunder's eyes flashed. She was blushing from his casual perusal, furious too. Roth put a finger to her lips and shushed her before she could say anything. "I just came to congratulate you on your recent nuptials, my dove," he said. "How is everything? Are you satisfied with the wealth of your husband's endowments?" he asked. He looked over at the naked Logan and scowled. "Well, I suppose you are. And my dear Duke Gyre, stand him up," Roth ordered. "Or should I say, Prince Gyre? Don't lose heart. I've seen her mother naked, and in time she'll—" Logan lunged forward, but his bonds held. One of the men hit him across the face. Roth continued as if there had been no interruption. He clucked his tongue. In time. There's the rub. In time, the princess might grow into these rather admirable breasts and hips. He smiled at her and pinched a cheek. Roth stood, and Neff's magic lifted Janine from the bed to stand, trembling next to her husband. "But you don't have time. I hope you've enjoyed your marriage, and Logan, friend, I hope you've not been wasting your time with foreplay, because your marriage is over." The moment drew out. There was nothing Roth loved so much as watching bewilderment turn to dread,
I have returned.
turn to despair. "Who are you?" Logan asked, his eyes betraying no fear. "I'm Roth. I'm the man who ordered your brother's death, Janine." Ignoring Logan, Roth watched the words break over the girl like a wave, but he didn't stop, didn't let her voice a denial. "I'm Roth, the Shinga of the Sakage. I'm the man who ordered your father's death, Janine. Not 10 minutes ago, I watched his head roll off a high table. I'm Prince Roth Ursul of Calador. I'm the man who ordered your sister's and your mother's deaths, Janine. If you listen, you might hear their cries." He put a finger to his ear and an attentive look on his face, mocking. "You two are all that's left between me and Cenaria's crown, Janine. And I'm going to take that crown. I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill you. Do you want to choose which of you dies first?" With each revelation, he watched her eyes, fed hungrily on her dying hope, gorged himself on her ripening despair. Roth drew a knife and turned her so she faced Logan. Logan cried out wordlessly, but Neff had gagged him. He bucked and strained against the bonds, his muscles taut, swelling, huge, but escaping Neff's magic was impossible. He could sooner tear stars from the heavens. "My lord," a soldier called from the hall, "one of the barges has been destroyed. The Meisters need you to help quell the resistance." Watching the hope bloom in the young girl's eyes gave Roth a shiver of excitement. "Resistance," he said. "Maybe they'll save you, but wait. Your hero is already here. Logan, are you just going to stand there? Aren't you going to save her?" The muscles in Logan's arms and legs bulged, and the magical bonds shifted and thinned until Neff spoke again, and they redoubled. The prince couldn't move. "I guess not," Roth said, turning back to Janine. "But you're the princess. Surely the royal guards will come. Why, I bet even now the Lord General is leading men here to rescue you." He brushed his hair back over a mangled ear. "But I killed Aegon, and all the royal guards. There are no more heroes. No one can save you, Janine." Roth stepped behind Janine and trailed his free hand up her slender stomach. He ripped her nightgown open, tore it off, and cupped a breast in his hand. As a tear rolled from her eye, he bent and kissed her neck like a lover. His eyes locked on Logan's, mocking. Then, where he'd kissed her, he cut her throat. Roth gave her a shove, and Janine stumbled into Logan's arms, the right side of her neck a fountain of blood. Neff loosed Logan's bonds enough that he could hold the girl, but not enough to reach up to try to stop the bleeding. Logan's eyes were wells of horror and pity, a sound like beatific music to Roth's ears, the sound of a soul at its utmost limit of suffering, escaped Logan's lips. He held the small, gasping girl to his chest. Roth devoured his horror, trying to lock this memory into his mind, knowing he would need this on the long, dark nights. But then Logan pulled back, turned so Roth couldn't see his face, and looked into Janine's face. "I'm here, Jenny," Logan said, holding the girl's eyes with his own. "I'm not going to leave you." The gentleness in his voice infuriated Roth. It was as if Roth didn't matter anymore. With his soothing voice, Logan was pulling Janine and himself out of this world of darkness, walling them off somewhere Roth couldn't go. As Janine stared into Logan's eyes, Roth could see her relax, not into death, but from despair. "You really would have loved me, wouldn't you?" she said. Roth knew he should have cut deeper, should have slashed her windpipe, and not just that single artery. He struck Logan across the face, but his blow might have been the buzzing of a gnat for all it did. The big man didn't even lose eye contact with the princess. "Jenny, Jenny," he said quietly. "I already love you. I'll be with you soon." "You're dying!" Roth shouted, not a pace away, but he might have been a summer breeze. Janine's knees trembled, and Logan pulled her back into his embrace, closing his eyes and whispering in her ear as her life bled out against his chest. "My lord, they need you now," the messenger said, more urgently. Logan didn't even look at Roth as Janine shuddered against his chest. He just kept whispering assurances. She sucked in 3 more labored breaths, and then sighed her life out in Logan's arms, her eyes fluttering closed. Neff released the bonds holding her slowly, and she crumpled to the floor. "No! No!" Roth yelled. She wasn't even afraid. He'd done everything right, and she wasn't even afraid to die. Who wasn't afraid to die? It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. He slapped Logan, once and again, and again, and again. "You won't die so easy, Logan Gyre," Roth snarled. He turned to his men. The muscle in his jaw twitched. "Take him to the maw, and give him the sodomites." "My lord," the messenger said, rushing into the room again. "You must—" He grabbed a handful of the messenger's hair. He stabbed at the man's face in a fury, wildly, again and again. He flung the man sideways and tried to cut his throat, but caught him above the ear instead. The knife turned, and a fat strip of hairy scalp came off in Roth's hand. The man wailed until Roth grabbed him again and cut his throat. Meanwhile, Neff had opened the hidden door out of the chamber. He lifted the princess's body with magic and floated it before him. "Neff, what are you doing?" "The God King wishes to have the heads of all the royal family displayed. Whatever you're planning, I'd advise you to hurry." He didn't address Roth by his title. Everything was going wrong, and Father would be here soon. Roth turned, panting, the gory strip of hair and flesh in his fist. He trembled with rage, and the men holding Logan went as white as paste. "Bring me his head when they're finished. But before you give him to the sodomites, cut his cock off and bring me his sack for a purse. I want him to bleed to death as they fuck him." Chapter 56. The antechamber at the base of the North Tower stank overwhelmingly of blood and feces released in death. The bitter tang of urine threaded through the stench. Kylar gagged as he opened the barred door. A quick glance told the story. The men had been trapped in the room, ambushed by crossbowmen. Kylar scowled. A crossbowman? In a room this small? Then he saw the narrow platform by the ceiling. Plainly visible in the shadows, welcomed Kylar's eyes. From the way the bodies were scattered, it had just been the one man, shooting the royal guards and nobles like fish in a barrel. So this was what happened to the men who'd come to save their prince. From the streaks of blood going out the door, it looked like only one man had survived to drag himself away. Sickened, Kylar ran up the stairs. He found 6 dead Caledorans at the entryway. The rest of the story was clear enough. Caught in bed with his wife, Logan's clothes were scattered around the room. Logan had sprung up and fought. He'd killed 6 fully armed Caledorans, but from the burn marks on the floor, he'd been hurt or disabled with magic. Then, from the wide, sticky puddle of blood, it was obvious that Roth had either killed Logan slowly so that he bled copiously, or had killed both him and his wife. Neither body was in the room. The Caledorans would want Logan's body along with the rest of the royal family's bodies, so the whole kingdom could see they were dead. The line of succession wiped out. A torn nightgown lay on the floor. The princess, young and beautiful as she was probably in a room somewhere being raped until she died of it. Kylar tried to interpret it another way. His mind analyzed the scene, trying to ward off the shock of despair. Was it possible the princess had been killed and Logan was alive? Soldiers wouldn't keep Logan alive and kill a princess whom they could rape. Logan was a warrior, a renowned swordsman, and the heir to the throne. The assassinations of the royal family had been carried out brutally, but precisely, carefully. If the Caledorans were going to make an exception and spare one life for any length of time, it wouldn't be Logan's. Grief hit Kylar like a physical blow. Logan was dead. His best friend was dead. Dead. And the blame could only be placed on Kylar. He could have stopped it. Kylar could have killed Durzo last night. Durzo's back had been there, a target he couldn't miss. Dorian had told him. What pain hadn't he inflicted on Logan? He'd allowed the murder of Logan's friend, Elaine, concealed the truth about Sierra's and Elaine's affair, sent to prison for murder, had forced him to break his engagement. Logan had been forced to marry a girl he didn't know, and had been murdered. His wife of less than an hour raped and killed. Sinking to the floor, Kylar wept. Logan, I'm sorry. It's all my fault. He reached a hand to steady himself, and found it in the puddle of blood. He looked at his bloody hand. Bloody as it had been bloodied in this very chamber 5 years ago, when he finished his first solo kill. Bloody as it had been bloody continually since he murdered his first innocent. This was where murder had brought him. It had brought him full circle. His murder of one innocent leading inexorably to the murder of more. In the last 5 years, he'd done exactly what he'd intended to do. He'd become more and more like Durzo Blint. He'd become a killer. He slept uneasily, so he slept light, so he was ever more dangerous. He was always on edge, and the blood that first covered his hands in this very room had never been washed clean. It had only been added to. It was no mistake that Logan's blood was on his hands now. No coincidence. The Drakes liked to talk about a divine economy, the god turning weeping into laughter, sorrow into joy. A wet boy was the merchant prince of the satanic economy. Murder begat murder. As Durzo had said, others always paid the price. Must others always pay for my failures? Is there no other way? The blood on his hands said no. No. This is reality. It's hard, uncomfortable, hateful. But it's true. I'm breaking my own rules. A blur of shadows said. Kylar didn't look up. He didn't care if he died. But the man said no more. After a long moment, Kylar asked bitterly,
Here we go.
Don't play fair. A kill is a kill. Durzo stepped out of the shadows. Kylar, I have one last rule to teach you. And what's that, Master? You're almost a wet boy now, Kylar. And now that you've learned to win almost any fight, there's one more rule. Never fight when you can't win. Fine, Kylar said. You win. Durzo stood there a long moment. Come, apprentice. Here is your crucible. Is that all your life is? Kylar asked, finally looking up. Tests and challenges? My life? That's all life is. That's not good enough, Kylar said. These people shouldn't be dying. Kalidor shouldn't be winning. It's not right. I never said it's right. My world isn't cut into black and white, right and wrong, Kylar. Yours shouldn't be either. Our world only has better and worse, shadows lighter and darker. Cenaria couldn't win against Kalidor no matter what happened tonight. This way, a few nobles die rather than tens of thousands of peasants. It's better this way. Better? My best friend's dead and they're probably raping his wife. How can you stand by and do nothing? How can you help them? Because life's empty, Durzo said. Bullshit! If you believe that, you'd have died a long time ago. I did die a long time ago. All the good passes by, and all the evil passes by. And we can't do a damn thing to change anything or anybody, Kylar, least of all ourselves. This war will come and go. There will be a victor, and people will die for nothing, but we'll be alive. Like always. At least, I will. It's not right. What do you want, justice? Justice is a fairy tale, a myth with soft fur and reassuring strength. A myth you believed in, once upon a time, Kylar said, gesturing to the word justice, etched into Retribution's blade. I used to believe a lot of things. That doesn't make them true, Durzo said. Who's better off? Logan or us? Logan could sleep at night. I hate myself. I dream of murder and wake in cold sweat. You drink yourself oblivious and blow your money on whores. Logan's dead, Durzo said. Maybe he'll wear a crown in the next life, but that doesn't do him much good now, does it? Kylar looked at Durzo strangely. And you're the one who says life is empty, meaningless, that we don't take anything of value when we take a life. Look how you hold on to yours, you fucking hypocrite. Every man worth a damn is a hypocrite. Durzo reached into a breast pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper.
Sounds like a fucking prophet.
If you kill me, this is for you. It explains things.
I guess when you're...
Consider it your inheritance.
Is...
If I kill you, well...
time?
When I die, I'll take a break on my way to the lowest plane of hell and stop to talk. Durzo tucked the paper in a breast pocket and drew a huge sword with a long red ribbon dangling from its hilt. It was a longer, heavier blade than Retribution, but with his talent, Durzo could wield it with a single hand. Don't do this, Kylar said. I don't want to fight you. The wet boy closed on him. Kylar stood still, making no move to defend himself. Did you already give him the globe of edges?
Throwing
Kylar
the tablet, kid.
The wet boy stopped.
You're gonna play with it, play with it.
He reached into a pouch and pulled out the silvery globe. This? He said. This is nothing. Another fake. He hurled the globe at the window. Glass broke as it punched through the window and sailed out into darkness. What have you done? Kylar asked. By the night angels, Durzo said. You bonded my Kakari. You stole it from me. You still don't understand? It was like he was speaking another language. Bonded? Kylar thought he'd bonded the Kakari. Must have, because his talent worked now. And Durzo said it was glass? Unbelievable, Durzo said, shaking his head. Draw your sword and fight, boy. It's my sword now, is it? Kylar asked. Not for long. You aren't worthy to succeed me.
Tablet.
Durzo raised his blade. I don't want to fight you, Kylar said, refusing to draw the blade. I won't fight you. Durzo struck. At the last second, Kylar drew retribution and blocked. Talent-strengthened blow met talent-strengthened blow. The blades shivered from the impact. I knew it was in you, Durzo said. He smiled fiercely. Any delusion Kylar might have had that Durzo would take it easy on him because he hadn't had time to learn to use his talent dissolved instantly. Durzo launched into a blistering attack so fast it should have been impossible. Kylar staggered backward, blocking some blows and jumping back to avoid more. Durzo used every weapon in his arsenal. His sword blurred through combinations, whipping the hilt ribbon into a scintillant red stream. The ribbon's purpose was to pull an opponent's eye from the point of danger.
Over to the phone.
Anyone who let his attention wander would find a steel reminder in his ribs. But it wasn't just the sword that confused Kylar. Durzo would follow a cut at Kylar's head with a kick at his knee, then a spinning backhand with his free hand at his face. Combinations followed and flowed into each other in a raging river of deadly motion. Blocking and dodging, Kylar retreated back and back. Durzo didn't give him time to think. But Kylar was aware of the room. It took up the entire top floor of the tower, so it formed a large circle flattened at one end for the entrance, and at the other for a closet. The very familiarity of fighting against Durzo slowly calmed him. Of course, he'd always lost, but things would be different this time. They had to be. The surge of power flowed through his arms with a rush of tingles that made him feel like every hair on his body was standing on end. He parried a thrust, and Durzo's blade was slapped aside as if it weighed a quarter of what it did. Blint recovered in a blink, but he stopped advancing. Kylar was standing a yard from the wall with a cherrywood bureau next to him. Blint's sword flicked toward his eyes, but it was a feint. Blint's real attack was a kick at Kylar's leading knee. Kylar dropped backward toward the wall and lashed out with a foot, halting Blint's foot as it came forward. Expecting his sword to meet resistance, Blint slashed too hard. His heavy blade slashed deeply into the bureau. The stone wall slapped against Kylar's back as he stumbled and levered himself upright again. But instead of trying to drag his sword out of the bureau, Durzo reached over his shoulders and grabbed twin hook swords. Each bore a crescent-shaped blade over the knuckles. It was otherwise a normal sword with a hooked point for catching an enemy's sword. "I hate those," Kylar said. "I know." Kylar attacked, still trying to adjust to the talent's effect on his fighting. So far as he could tell, it could make his muscles move more quickly and more powerfully, but there was a limit to how fast even two talented fighters could fight. talent didn't help you make decisions faster, so it wasn't a simple matter of accelerating regular fighting. Kylar had to be more careful, and he still had no idea if the talent would defend his body itself. If Blint got through Kylar's defenses with a tight kick, would it crush his ribs like twigs, or were they strengthened as well? The only way to find out was no way to find out. Blint let Kylar come forward, using the hook swords defensively. Then, as they neared the bed, he started using the hooks. As Kylar struck, Durzo turned his blade down to the hook and wrenched Retribution aside. He followed with an overhead slash with the other sword. Leaping backward, Kylar found himself being driven toward one of the tower's broad windows. Durzo strode in and caught a slow slash, but instead of sweeping it aside, he caught it with his other hook, trapping Kylar's blade. As Kylar lunged forward, Blint guided the blade past his head and wrenched it free. Retribution clattered on the floor behind Kylar. Blint kicked him in the chest, his foot barely slowed by the arms Kylar brought up as he drew daggers. Kylar slammed into the window and felt glass break, wood splinter, and the latch burst. He had the sickening sensation of launching into space. Clawing for something, anything, Kylar turned, twisting with the desperate grace of a falling cat. Abandoned to gravity, his daggers spun away, glittering in the moonlight. Kylar punched his fingers through a delicate window pane. His hand clamped on wood and jagged glass as his momentum swung the window open. His face met the tower wall with a crunch. Glass glided through the flesh of his fingers, then ground against bone as his hand slipped. Held. Blinking, he dangled by one hand. Blood coursed down his arm. Blood coursed down his face. He hung 200 feet over the basalt of the castle's foundation and the broad expanse of the river. Steam escaped from the single volcanic vent that opened on Voss Island and obscured a barge pulled up to the shore. The steam shone in the moonlight, and far below, by the ship, Kylar saw men talking. Even from this height, he could hear the ringing of steel and catch glimpses of Caladoran invaders overwhelming foot soldiers in the castle courtyard. Then, Sergeant Gamble emerged from the front gate. He was leading the nobles and more than 200 Cenarian soldiers. They were trying to escape the castle, just as Kylar had told them. But even as they pushed toward the east gate, the Caladorans were reinforced by more than 100 Highlanders coming from the opposite side of the castle. In seconds, the courtyard had become the front line of the battle and the war for Cenaria. The castle and the city were lost. If the nobles were slaughtered, so was all of Cenaria. If the nobles could press through the massed Highlanders and get across East King's Bridge, they could begin a resistance. It was the dimmest sort of hope, but hope had never come in the blinding bright variety in Cenaria.